Think about where your identity used to live: physical wallets, filing cabinets, maybe scattered across a bunch of government databases. Well, all of that is rapidly moving onto blockchains. We are talking about a system built from the ground up to be permanent, entirely transparent, and mathematically impossible to erase. But here's the really big question that almost nobody is asking right now. If your identity actually becomes digital infrastructure, who exactly controls it? Now, the technology promises us ultimate freedom, right? Self-sovereign identity, absolute privacy, true ownership, no central authority, and definitely no gatekeepers. But when you start to actually peel back the layers of this architecture, things get incredibly complicated. Because at the end of the day, identities still need to be verified, access still has to be approved, and the systems issuing those credentials, they might actually become more powerful than ever before. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack a pretty critical puzzle. Are blockchains truly decentralizing identity, or are they just rebuilding control in a completely new form? Because once your identity goes on-chain, it's not just personal information anymore. It literally becomes access, power, and permission itself. But before we really dive into all of this, please note, this explainer on the channel, Blocks, Bonds, Funds, is created for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial or investment advice. All right, so to understand where we're heading, we really have to take a hard look at the fragile system we're all using today. Right now, governments, banks, and those massive digital platforms collect and verify who you are through this messy web of passwords, scanned documents, and physical biometrics. Modern identity is entirely centralized. It's completely controlled by institutions. And what does that do? It creates these massive, vulnerable honeypots of data. We see data breaches spreading like wildfire, while your personal information just endlessly flows between corporations, building up these institutional surveillance systems that constantly hover right above us. And the sheer scale of this centralized vulnerability, it is absolutely staggering. Just look at India's Aadhaar biometric system as a prime example. It acts as a unified identity layer for over 1.25 billion people. That is 1.25 billion individuals whose biometric data is routed straight through a massive, centrally controlled institution. Now, it's an undeniable marvel of modern infrastructure for sure, but it also highlights the immense concentration of power and massive risk sitting squarely in the hands of a single issuing authority. So the blockchain space is trying to radically dismantle that exact concentration of power through something called self-sovereign identity, or SSI. The whole idea with an SSI framework is that you, the individual, become the absolute sole custodian of your own identity. So instead of relying on a government database or some massive tech giant to prove who you are, you have a digital wallet holding your verified credentials, and it moves them directly across an open, decentralized network. The promise here is massive: true ownership and self-sovereignty. But that raises a pretty obvious issue, right? How do you actually prove something about yourself to a network without just handing over all your sensitive data anyway? Well, that is where the real magic comes in. Zero knowledge proofs, or ZKPs. You can think of a ZKP as the ultimate privacy shield. It's a cryptographic protocol that lets you verify your identity without ever exposing the underlying personal data. For instance, you can mathematically prove to a platform that you're over 18 without ever revealing your exact birth date or your address or anything else. You just provide the proof and the verifier trusts the math. Simple as that. When you zoom out, all of this builds into this brilliant architecture known as the trust triangle. It's made up of the issuer, the holder, which is you, and the verifier. An institution issues your credential, and you lock it safely in your wallet. Then, when a verifier needs to check your status, you don't send over your raw personal data, you simply present that zero-knowledge proof. The verifier then checks a decentralized registry, like Ethereum, just to confirm the credential is valid. The blockchain stores the verification systems, but your full raw identity data, that stays completely off-chain. And this creates what researchers are now calling a dual-layer privacy shield. By leveraging really advanced cryptographic protocols like zk-STARKs, these privacy-preserving blockchains can finally balance two massive conflicting forces. On one side, you have the absolute need for individual sovereignty, and on the other, the completely unavoidable requirement for institutional compliance. You get to keep your data perfectly private while the network maintains its mathematical immutability. Honestly, it sounds like a perfect, trustless utopia. But here is where we hit a pretty massive system glitch. Think about it. If the architecture is entirely decentralized and you are the one holding the keys, who actually controls your identity? This is exactly where we have to shift away from that utopian promise of the technology and look at the highly complicated reality of hidden institutional dependencies. Because the truth is, the blockchain doesn't magically create trust out of nowhere. It just reorganizes how that trust is enforced. And this brings us right to the decentralization paradox. It's the illusion of ownership. Yes, absolutely, you control the cryptographic wallet. You have the power of selective disclosure. But look closer at where the actual power sits in this dynamic. Institutions are still the ones controlling the credential issuance. They control the verification standards, the compliance overlays, and crucially, the revocation rights. You might own the digital wallet itself, but your self-sovereign identity still depends entirely on institutional trust. Ultimately, governments and banks are still defining the rules of the game. Because your digital identity doesn't just spring out of thin air, right? The entire digital identity lifecycle relies on a deeply fragmented web of credential issuers. Just think about it for a second. Hospitals, utility providers, employers, universities, governments. Your whole self-sovereign setup is entirely dependent on these traditional institutions to actually issue the credentials in the first place. Without their initial approval, your amazing decentralized wallet is essentially just an empty container. This heavy reliance is perfectly captured by recent analyses of real-world deployments. Take the Bhutan National Digital Identity System, for example. It is one of the most advanced rollouts in the world right now, but despite using decentralized tech, researchers specifically note that SSI-aligned approaches are still dependent on centralized components, even on top of decentralized infrastructures. At the end of the day, the system inevitably relies on national laws and centralized trust registries to dictate exactly how your credentials are managed. So how does this actually roll out to the public in practice? Well, it usually starts with biometric enrollment, capturing your face or your fingerprint. Then, secure blockchain hashing encrypts that data, making sure it stays off the public network, while generating a universal digital identity number. Finally, we reach programmable global access. Your physical body is literally merged directly with a global programmable blockchain network. Your face effectively becomes your passport, your password, and your permanent node in the system. Identity is rapidly becoming globally programmable infrastructure. But beneath that incredibly seamless scan of your face lies a massive hidden architecture. The real control doesn't actually live in the decentralized blockchain itself. Control exists in the infrastructure running right behind it. We're talking about the issuers, the blockchain validators processing your transactions, and the massive corporate cloud providers hosting the nodes. Power concentrates precisely where verification is controlled, which creates these hidden dependency lines directly behind the decentralized front end. And nation-states, they are rapidly adapting their identity systems to capture this infrastructure. Organizations are already deeply exploring how to integrate zero-knowledge proofs for things like GDPR compliance and standard know-your-customer checkpoints. State actors are realizing that they can enforce regulatory checkpoints directly at the protocol level. They don't even need to hold all your data to control the system anymore. They just need to mandate that your decentralized wallet passes a compliance check before you're legally allowed to transact. Which brings us to a frankly chilling reality. Privacy and surveillance can actually emerge from the exact same infrastructure. The very cryptographic tools built to protect your privacy off-chain can simultaneously be used to enable massive biometric surveillance. Because the system is built on standardized compliance overlays, institutions can just monitor the flow of verification. They create this perfectly visible web of who is permitted to do what and where, without ever needing to read the underlying data itself. And if they control the flow of verification, they dictate exactly who gets to participate. In this new paradigm, control operates entirely through access and exclusion. The blockchain might run forever, perfectly immutable, sure, but if an institution decides you are no longer compliant, they can simply revoke your credentials via smart contracts. Suddenly, accounts are suspended, digital wallets are restricted. You could wake up to find your systemic access entirely denied, effectively locking you out of the modern digital economy with the simple flip of a cryptographic switch.
And this matters profoundly because we are pulling back to a macro view where identity is no longer just a driver's license sitting in your pocket. Identity is becoming a universal access layer. It's seamlessly integrating with decentralized finance, healthcare networks, global mobility, and our digital workplaces into one giant programmable ecosystem. Identity completely stops being about personal data. It is becoming the fundamental operating system of the digital world itself.
Researchers envision a future where, to quote the literature directly, identity ceases to be a fragmented document-based construct and becomes a universal, permanent, and secure feature of human existence. Now, on paper, it's a grand, almost utopian vision of a frictionless, borderless digital existence. But you absolutely have to contrast that beautiful promise with the looming threat of systemic exclusion and those centralized choke points we've just mapped out.
So, we are left with a really profound question as we transition head first into this programmable society. Are blockchains truly decentralizing our identity, or are they simply rebuilding institutional control in a much more efficient, permanent form? Because in a world where your physical self merges with a digital network, ultimate control depends entirely on who grants access to the system, who really holds the keys to your programmable self. It's a question we all need to answer before the infrastructure becomes completely invisible.